But I'm glad you're all here, and the rain has stopped for the minute. And you know, this is Bill Ryan, who is your tour guide, and he does a wonderful job, and we do appreciate it so much. So, as you know, your $20 was a tax-deductible gift to the Historical Society, so you get a deduction and a wonderful trip. And I know you have enjoy your lunch at Bull Creek, and so long.
I don't want you to think you're the first one to do this. Now, I'm a little older than I look. And so April 1916, I got on the Dearborn station in Chicago with the Dixie Flyer, and we ran this train down to Bunnell, a chartered train, for a tour. So we've been doing this tour since, well, this says here April 18th, 1916, and it would have cost you round trip $41.89. Wow. And we would have put you up here in Bunnell at an exclusive hotel called the Hallican, which is still here. And so these tours have been going on for some time. Now, why were there tours? Well, this was a planned community. Bunnell was one of the very first planned communities in Florida, and they called it the Bunnell Colony. And they had two land development companies. One was run by Mr. Moody here in Bunnell. The other was out on western Flagler, and it was reached by steamboat. So our tours back then came here by steamboat, coming down the St. Lawrence, St. Lawrence, what am I saying? St. John's River. Hey, look, if I make mistakes, I'm a little older than I look, and I don't always remember what I had for breakfast. So you're going to have to. You understand? Okay. Yeah. Now, fortunately, I just published another book. I've got 6 books. This is number 7, and it's called Journey into History, Flagler County, and this is what I'm going to use. So if I'm reading my own book, I don't remember writing it. So it's very helpful. Okay, now where we're at, this is the home of Tom Holden. And this house is 100 years old. It's not a museum, it's a house. You could live in it. You could move in that house today. But it's the way it was 100 years from now. And we always feel that kids and young people should see the way things are. As we were talking this morning, I can't change history. There were a lot of bad things happen. I'm not going to say they weren't. We're going to be talking about some of them on this tour. But the whole purpose of this tour is to show you the magic that Flagler County's got. Because believe me, we do have some magic. And it takes some imagination on your part, because this is not Disney World. We don't have stuffed Lincolns and people jumping up in white wigs. That's not going to happen. But we will show you a lot about Flagler County and things that you may not know. Okay, now our driver is Bob. And Bob is going to take us, and hopefully we won't get lost. So here we go. Now, we're going to start at the Coquina City Hall, or Lake Lucille. Remember that they wanted to bring visitors here, and they were willing to bring a chartered train down from Chicago. They wanted to have tours here because they wanted to sell you houses and land here. And they'd sell you a nice house here for $10 down and $10 a month. Or for $20 down and $20 a month, they'd sell you it's a farmland. And you could sit out here and raise potatoes. They said they lied. They said you could get 3 crops a year, and you could come into the market 3 months ahead of the market, and you could make your fortune. If you got on a train and came down here from Chicago and bought land, you'd be a rich man. Well, guess what? Some of them did become rich. But in any event, this is one of the early settlements in Florida. Now, we're crossing Moody Boulevard. This was once part of the Dixie Highway. This was one of the first planned highways built in the United States. And it did run from Chicago and Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and it ran right through here. This was it. We're crossing the part of the old Dixie Highway. This was a brick road that, as I say, ran all the way from Chicago, right here, right through past the Holden House. So can you imagine these early Model T Ford touring cars? Remember, cars had just been invented and tourism didn't exist. Tourism was invented right here, your first tourist. There were no gas stations, there were no motels. They didn't exist. They hadn't even been thought of. So there's a lot going on here. Now we're going by the old courthouse. Most of this was built in the 1920s. This courthouse was finished in 1927. It's presently occupied by a school. There's over 300 children in this school. They've rebuilt the inside, and it is gorgeous inside. It is a mint building in perfect condition. And there is a school, church school, inside the old courthouse. Now, Lake Lucille was basically built to lure you down here. And this was a bunch of local artisans dug up coquina rock. They'd seen the fort in St. Augustine, so they built a city hall based upon cut coquina rock, which was cut right here in Flagler County. So this is the same construction as the fort in St. Augustine. It should be good for a couple thousand years. It's not occupied at the present time, and it's available for events. But these were local artisans. These rocks were dug up right here in Flagler County, the coquina rock, and these artisans were so good that this is being listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And I might add, the Holden House, just a few weeks ago, made the National Register of Historic Places. So here we are at Lake Lucille. This was originally a mud hole, a mud pit, and the locals used wheelbarrows to haul away the mud and make this lake. They constructed this lake, and they called it Lake Lucille. The purpose, of course, was to bring you in here. They called this the Bunnell Colony. They hired an ad agency in Chicago, and they put out a newspaper called the Bunnell Home Builder, which was published in different languages, and it was published all over the world in 1918, different languages, and it had stories about the great success of people coming here and getting rich, raising potatoes, and being in the market 3 months in advance. Were the stories true? Yeah, they were. These were some of the first detailed stories I think ever done. I used to work for a big city newspaper, and I was always tasked to write stories like this. But when you think these are people back in 1918, 1919, doing these feature stories, and they were doing it about Bunnell. So this wasn't a place of gas stations. Remember, back then cars had just been invented. Cars basically didn't exist. So you didn't have all these gas stations. The main drag here was along the railroad. It was called Railroad Street, and there were a lot of fancy houses, high-priced houses, a few of which are still there. And many people are starting to buy these houses and reconstruct them and try to bring back what was here. But remember, back in the 1920s, this is before the Great American Depression, there was a lot of optimism here. The boys had come back from World War I. There was only one lad killed. He was an African-American lad that died in World War I, and he was the only one that perished. But they came back here full of optimism. This town became a thriving little farm town. And as I say, it doesn't resemble today what it was in the 1930s, but it was full of optimism and full of promise for the future. Okay? Onward. And a planned community. Now on your left you'll see a big white building as we come up here. That would be the headquarters of Mr. Moody. You'd be up here at the stoplight. See that big white building up there on the left? That was Moody's headquarters, and he owned about 30,000 acres of land, which was a lot of land, and they were very anxious to sell it to you. So you could say that this is a planned community. The railroad station was nearby, and the trains would stop here, and of course we had a network of trains across the United States, and you could go anywhere. You could buy a ticket and get on a train and go someplace. Isn't that novel? We don't have that today. We're a car society. But a lot has happened in the last 100 years. And the thing about Florida, and this is striking, if you see it today, it won't be there tomorrow. I mean, we've had rampant development, rampant change in Florida, and sometimes you have to use your imagination to see what was here, or read a book that was written by somebody. Just came out. Oh, I've had fun on these tours. Every now and then we'll get somebody that's a resident here, that's lived here for God knows how long, and they're just rattling with stories. And those stories are such fun. Now, there are two school systems here. There was the Carver High School system, and there was the Bunnell, or the Flagler system, and they were separate school systems. Both were pretty good. They weren't bad at all. But there weren't many roads here. Now, on your right, see this little red brick building on your right? That's the telephone exchange. That's where Lucille used to sit there on the party line and listen in to what everybody was saying. That's when the telephone came here. Her name was Lucille Walker. She was born in 1907, and she worked her whole career here right up to about 1939. Now, we're turning into a section of Bunnell. These are the original little cottages that were offered to you for $10 down 100 years ago. Now here you have to use your imagination. Architects have come here. This is called the Florida cottage style, and this actually was a piece of architecture. Look on your right, that little cottage with a tin roof. That's one of the originals. That's 100 years old plus. Now there's been many changes here. There's been redevelopment, siding added on, but for the most part, these buildings are the original cottages that were offered by the Bunnell Land Company 100 years ago. And what always fascinates me is that, in essence, many of the original families are still here. They still live here, 3 and 4 generations ago. But you have to be either an architect, or you've got to be someone crazy like me that has a lot of imagination to see what was here. I mean, these are the original cottages right here, 100 years old. They don't look 100 years old. Now, what do you think the city of Palm Coast is going to look like 100 years from now with some of our chintzy houses that we bought in Palm Coast? I mean, will they be built this good? Will they still look this good 100 years from now? I'm pretty impressed with these, because obviously people have made changes. They've tore structures down, they built brick houses, and so forth. But the original little cottages are right here, and you're in ground zero. This is very much like Levittown in New York City, which was another planned community. And this is it, right here. You're in ground zero of early Florida development. And it's not a bad little area. And some of the families still live here. And if you've got a lot of imagination, and you kind of can squint your eyes a little bit, you can see those old cottages are still there. They're like a shadow of their former self, but they're there. They're there. There's new siding and new roofs, but the originals still are alive, and they're breathing, and they're still very much here. Now we're coming up on the Bunnell Elementary School, And back a long time ago in the 1920s, they had a little brick structure called the FAA, Future Farmers of America. And the locals decided to run a museum. Remember I said there were two school systems here. There weren't any roads to speak of, so they had all these one-room schoolhouses. They had them for the African American residents, and they had them for the Caucasian residents. Two complete separate school systems. And from what I read and understand, they were both pretty good. They weren't so bad at all. In fact, I found letters. Mary Beth Bethune was supplying teachers to the Flagler school system from Bethune, and she brought them down here with teaching certificates, and these were African American teachers. Those documents are all contained in that little red brick building on your left. That's called the Little Red Schoolhouse, and that's a museum that was built back in about the 1940s. It's identical to a schoolroom of 1918. The children's clothing are still hanging on hooks. The desks are there. The books used in 1918 are on the desks. These blackboards have the lesson plan. There is a retired teacher here called Diane Marquis, and to tour that place, it's hard. You have to apply at the school office. You have to contact Diane Marquis, which is a miracle if you do, and she will then take you through that place. And it is